In 1996, the biggest rapper on Earth was shot dead in Las Vegas. 6 months later, his rival was gunned down in Los Angeles. Both murders remain officially unsolved nearly 30 years later. Both artists were connected to the same record label. That label made some of the greatest music in hip-hop history. It also left a trail of destroyed careers, broken contracts, federal investigations, and dead bodies that no other company in the music industry has ever matched. At its peak, this label was worth over $100 million. Within a few years, it was bankrupt. Its founder is currently serving 28 years in prison for manslaughter. And the story of how it all happened reveals something disturbing about what happens when violence becomes a business model. This is Death Row Records, the most dangerous record label that ever existed. And almost everyone who built it paid with their freedom, their fortune, or their life. Death Row Records didn't start with music, it started with intimidation. Marion Suge Knight grew up in Compton, California. He played football at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and briefly with the Los Angeles Rams as a replacement player during the 1987 NFL strike. When football didn't work out, he became a bodyguard and concert promoter. But Suge Knight had something that most music industry newcomers didn't, a reputation for physical intimidation that preceded him everywhere he went. The founding story of Death Row Records is itself a crime story. In the early 1990s, a young rapper and producer named Andre Young, known as Dr. Dre, was trapped in a contract with Ruthless Records, owned by Eazy-E and managed by Jerry Heller. Dre wanted out. The contract wouldn't let him leave. According to multiple sources, including former Ruthless Records employees and law enforcement investigators, Suge Knight visited Eazy-E and Jerry Heller and persuaded them to release Dre from his contract. The word persuaded is doing enormous work in that sentence. Multiple people present have described threats of violence during these meetings. Jerry Heller wrote in his memoir that Knight came with members of a certain street organization and that the meetings were terrifying. Former Death Row artist Danny Boy has described baseball bats being present. The exact details vary depending on who's telling the story, but the outcome is consistent. Dre was released from his Ruthless contract, and the method used to secure that release set the template for how Death Row would operate for the rest of its existence. Think about what just happened. A record label was founded through intimidation, not through talent scouting, not through business innovation, through fear. And here's the pattern interrupt that makes this story so disturbing. It worked. Brilliantly. Because the talent that Suge Knight obtained through intimidation was Dr. Dre, and Dr. Dre was about to create the most commercially successful hip-hop album of the early 1990s. With financial backing from Interscope Records and its co-founder Jimmy Iovine, Death Row Records was officially launched in 1991. The combination was explosive. Dre's musical genius, Interscope's corporate infrastructure, and Suge Knight's willingness to use any means necessary to get what he wanted. The label that was born through threats was about to become the most dominant force in music. But every person who helped build it would eventually wish they'd never walked through the door. In November 1992, Dr. Dre released The Chronic on Death Row Records. It changed hip-hop forever. The album essentially invented G-Funk, a smooth, melodic style built on synthesizers, deep bass, and laid-back vocal delivery that became the sound of the West Coast. It debuted at number 3 on the Billboard 200 and eventually sold over 6 million copies. But The Chronic didn't just make Death Row successful. It introduced the world to a young rapper from Long Beach, California named Calvin Broadus, better known as Snoop Dogg. Snoop's debut album, Doggystyle, released in November 1993, became the first debut album in history to enter the Billboard 200 at number 1. It sold over 800,000 copies in its first week. Death Row was now the hottest label in music, not just hip-hop, music, period. But behind the platinum plaques, the culture inside Death Row was something that most employees described in language usually reserved for criminal organizations. Multiple former Death Row employees have described the label's offices as a place where violence was routine, fights broke out regularly, weapons were visible, people who disagreed with Suge Knight faced physical consequences. Here's a detail that captures the atmosphere perfectly.
Death Row had a policy for meetings. According to multiple former employees, when an artist or executive met with Suge Knight, they were sometimes required to remove their jewelry and valuables before entering the room, not because of theft, because meetings with Suge occasionally became physical, and you didn't want your chain getting ripped off your neck during the discussion. Think about that. A record label where business meetings had a jewelry removal policy because the CEO might attack you. Producer DJ Quick described the atmosphere as walking on eggshells every single day. Multiple engineers and studio musicians have described being threatened or physically confronted for minor disagreements. And yet, people stayed because Death Row was printing money. The label's roster expanded. Dre, Snoop, Corrupt, Daz Dillinger, Nate Dogg, The Lady of Rage, The Dog Pound. Every release sold hundreds of thousands, if not millions. At its peak, Death Row Records was generating an estimated $100 million or more in annual revenue. The label had a clothing line, a movie production company, and plans for a chain of nightclubs. But Suge Knight wasn't just building an empire, he was making enemies, and the biggest enemy he made would change the course of music history forever. The question nobody was asking at the time, but everyone should have been asking, was simple. What happens when two record labels go to war and both sides are willing to use more than words?
In 1995, Tupac Shakur was sitting in a New York prison on sexual assault charges. He had been convicted and sentenced to up to 4.5 years. He couldn't afford the $1.4 million bail. Suge Knight visited him in prison. The deal was simple. Death Row would post Tupac's bail. In exchange, Tupac would sign a 3-album deal with the label. From a business perspective, this was genius. Tupac was arguably the most talented and certainly the most controversial rapper alive. Signing him was like adding a nuclear weapon to an already powerful arsenal. But from a human perspective, this deal was a trap. Tupac was desperate. He was in prison, he was broke, he was scared, and Suge Knight showed up with a checkbook and a contract. The power dynamic couldn't have been more imbalanced. Tupac signed. When he got out, the music was extraordinary. All Eyez on Me became the first double-disc studio album in hip-hop history. It debuted at #1 and has since sold over 10 million copies. Songs like California Love and How Do You Want It became iconic. Death Row was now at the absolute peak of its power, the biggest rapper in the world on the biggest label in the world. But Tupac's arrival also accelerated the most destructive conflict in music history. The East Coast-West Coast rivalry had been simmering for years. New York-based Bad Boy Records, led by Sean Diddy Combs and anchored by the notorious B.I.G., represented one coast. Death Row represented the other. What had started as competitive lyrics and subliminal disses escalated into something genuinely dangerous. Suge Knight openly antagonized Bad Boy at public events. At the 1995 Source Awards, he stood on stage and said, "Any artists that want to be an artist and stay a star and don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the videos, all on the records, dancing, come to Death Row." Everyone knew he was talking about Diddy. The crowd erupted. The line between musical competition and personal hostility had been crossed publicly and permanently. Tupac released diss tracks aimed at Biggie. Biggie responded. The media amplified every exchange. Fans took sides. The atmosphere became toxic. And underneath the music beef, something far more dangerous was happening. People connected to both sides were being threatened. People connected to both sides were being assaulted. This wasn't a rap beef anymore. It was a war. And wars have casualties.
On November 30, 1994, Tupac Shakur was shot 5 times in the lobby of Quad Recording Studios in Manhattan. He survived. Tupac believed Biggie and Diddy were involved in the shooting, or at least knew about it in advance. Both Biggie and Diddy denied any involvement. The shooting was never solved. But from that moment forward, Tupac's anger became nuclear, and Death Row gave him the platform to express it. The diss tracks escalated. Hit 'Em Up, released in 1996, is considered one of the most vicious songs in hip-hop history. Tupac didn't just insult Biggie's music, he made deeply personal claims. The song was a declaration of war set to music. Meanwhile, Suge Knight was facing his own legal problems. In February 1996, he was caught on surveillance camera kicking and beating a man named Orlando Anderson at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas. This incident would become critical to everything that followed. But the violence wasn't limited to Suge and Tupac. Death Row's connections to street gangs, particularly the mob Piru Bloods from Compton, were extensively documented by law enforcement. Federal investigators from the FBI and ATF monitored Death Row's operations. The LAPD had an active investigation into the label's financial dealings and gang connections. Former LAPD detective Russell Poole, who investigated the murders connected to Death Row, described the label as a criminal enterprise that happened to make music. There were also persistent allegations of corruption within the LAPD itself. Off-duty officers were accused of providing security for Death Row events and potentially participating in illegal activity. The Rampart scandal, which exposed widespread corruption within the LAPD's anti-gang unit, had overlapping connections to Death Row's orbit. Here's what makes this period so difficult to untangle. The line between music industry, gang activity, and law enforcement corruption was completely blurred. You couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Death Row existed in a space where platinum records and criminal investigations coexisted, where hit songs were recorded in the same buildings where illegal activity allegedly occurred, where the same people who were producing the most popular music in America were being surveilled by federal agencies. No other record label in history has ever operated in this kind of environment, not before and not since. And then came September 1996, and everything shattered.
On September 7, 1996, Tupac Shakur attended the Mike Tyson vs. Bruce Seldon boxing match at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. Suge Knight was with him. After the fight, surveillance cameras captured Suge Knight, Tupac, and members of their entourage physically attacking Orlando Anderson in the MGM Grand lobby, the same Orlando Anderson that Suge had been previously recorded assaulting. Later that evening, Tupac and Suge were driving on Las Vegas Boulevard. Tupac was in the passenger seat of Suge's black BMW 750IL. At approximately 11:15 p.m., a white Cadillac pulled up alongside them at a red light. Someone in the Cadillac opened fire. Tupac was hit 4 times. 2 rounds struck his chest, 1 hit his arm, 1 hit his thigh. Suge Knight was grazed by a bullet fragment or shrapnel on his head. Tupac was rushed to University Medical Center. He underwent multiple surgeries. He was placed on life support. He fought for 6 days. On September 13, 1996, Tupac Shakur died. He was 25 years old. The murder has never been officially solved, though Las Vegas police arrested Dwayne "Keffy" D in 2023 and charged him with murder in connection with the shooting. The case is currently proceeding through the courts. 6 months later, on March 9, 1997, the notorious B.I.G. was shot and killed in Los Angeles after leaving a party at the Peterson Automotive Museum. He was 24 years old. That murder also remains officially unsolved. Let that sit for a moment. 2 of the greatest artists in hip-hop history, both dead before their 26th birthdays, both murders connected to the same rivalry, both murders unsolved for nearly 3 decades before any arrests. The conspiracy theories are endless. Some point to Death Row's gang connections, some point to LAPD corruption, some point to internal conflicts within Bad Boy, some point to the broader gang rivalries that both labels were entangled with. What is not a theory is this: the environment that Death Row Records created and thrived in contributed directly to an atmosphere where 2 young men were murdered. The music was a soundtrack to real violence, and the people running the labels treated that violence as marketing. Tupac and Biggie didn't just die because of a rap beef. They died because they were trapped inside a system where violence was normalized, encouraged, and profitable.
After Tupac's death, Death Row Records disintegrated rapidly. Dr. Dre had already left. He walked away in 1996 before Tupac's murder. He later said he left because the environment had become unbearable. He reportedly had to forfeit his financial stake in Death Row and his production royalties just to get out. Think about that. One of the greatest producers in music history had to give up millions just to escape the label he helped build. Snoop Dogg left shortly after. He transferred to No Limit Records in 1998. Multiple other artists followed. Without Dre and Snoop, Death Row had no creative engine. Without Tupac, they had no star. The music stopped selling. The revenue dried up. But the legal problems were just beginning. Suge Knight was sentenced to 9 years in prison in 1997 for violating his probation by participating in the Orlando Anderson beating at the MGM Grand, the same night Tupac was shot. While Knight was in prison, Death Row's finances collapsed. Lawsuits piled up. Artists and producers sued for unpaid royalties. Creditors demanded payment. The IRS investigated tax irregularities. In 2006, Death Row Records filed for bankruptcy. Its catalog of music, which included some of the most valuable recordings in hip-hop history, was eventually auctioned off. The masters that Dre and Snoop and Tupac created were sold to the highest bidder. The label that had been worth over $100 million was sold at auction for approximately $18 million, a fraction of its peak value. And Suge Knight wasn't finished destroying his own life. After his release from prison, Knight was involved in multiple violent incidents, lawsuits, and legal proceedings. In January 2015, Knight was involved in a confrontation outside a Compton restaurant where he ran over 2 men with his truck, killing Terry Carter and injuring Clee-Bone Sloan. Knight claimed it was self-defense. In 2018, he pled no contest to voluntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison. He is currently incarcerated and will be eligible for parole in 2034 at the earliest. He will be 69 years old. From founding a label through intimidation to dying in prison for killing a man with his truck, that's the arc of Suge Knight's life. Death Row Records lasted approximately 7 years as a dominant force in music. In that time, it produced some of the greatest hip-hop ever recorded. It also destroyed nearly every life it touched. Dr. Dre lost millions escaping. Snoop Dogg had to rebuild his career from scratch. Tupac Shakur is dead. The Notorious B.I.G. is dead. Orlando Anderson, who was suspected of involvement in Tupac's shooting, was himself shot and killed in 1998 at age 23. Suge Knight will likely die in prison. The music was brilliant. The cost was catastrophic.
Death Row Records is the clearest example in music history of what happens when talent meets violence and violence wins. The music survives. The Chronic still sounds revolutionary. All Eyez on Me still hits. Doggystyle still bangs. But the people who made that music paid prices that no platinum plaque could justify. 2 dead artists, a founder in prison for manslaughter, a producer who had to abandon millions to escape, an entire genre scarred by a rivalry that turned lethal. Death Row didn't just make music, it proved that when you build an empire on intimidation, the empire eventually turns on everyone inside it, including the person who built it. If this changed how you see the music industry, subscribe. We investigate the crimes, empires, and dark histories that shaped the world. I'll see you in the next one.